obviously, I mean, he's come away with the notion that Barker is very much a sort of unconscious Marxist, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
At least he's exploring Marxist ideas in Imagica, which is it is definitely there.
I mean, it's we talked about it when we talked about it, didn't we? It's unquestionably a revolutionary text. I mean, I don't think there can be any doubt whatsoever about that.
No, I mean, if you don't come away with that, then I don't know how you could have possibly read it at all, you know.
And the thing is, you know, revolutions can be, can be right wing or left wing. There's nothing inherently about revolution itself that, I mean, of course, you get reactionary revolutions all the time. It's not. It's clearly not a reactionary revolution.
Well, evidently,
you know,
it's like, the exact opposite, right? It's anti-reactionary.
And anti-authoritarian, and I think it's I'm really glad. Well, hopefully, I mean, we'll chat. Maybe we'll get him on mic at some. I'd love to.
Oh, absolutely, yes, he's up. He's well up for it. He really is buzzing to get. He's writing stuff as well. He's writing. There's going to be articles about this. So,
it's so, isn't it great? I was thinking about this the other day. There's this thing about great art like that it's just that it's like a hand grenade that just keeps going off. You know what I mean? Like it sits out there, and I mean, we talked about it on previous podcasts. I mean, we both remember. May not remember the specifics of how old we were necessarily, but we remember that first reading experience, right?
Yeah, you just can't not, especially if you're like interested in writing, if you're interested in fiction. It's like, I remember, you know what, I remember so clearly when I first finished reading it and thinking, like, why the fuck am I not studying this? Why is this not on university courses? Why is this not like mentioned in the same breath as like J.G. Ballard or Philip K. Dick or Ursula K. Le Guin? Because it is one of the great fantasy novels. I mean that, like, without exception. That is not without caveat. That is not like some kind of hyperbole. I mean it stands up there alongside the likes of Frankenstein and War of the Worlds and Lord of the Rings, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
It belongs in that company. It is
absolutely
part of that proud noble tradition and builds on it in amazing ways. I think it's it's an extraordinary piece of work, and it's one of I would say maybe half a dozen of Barker's work that you could point out and say are operating on that kind of a level at least.
Definitely.
Quite
I mean,
extraordinary.
that whole oeuvre, where like from like the late 1980s through to the late 1990s, everything he writes, everything he puts out there is insanely good.
But I do think as well, like I was thinking about that again, I think we did talk about it, but the comparison I make with Imagica, to me, it's like, I remember when King brought out It, and he described it at the time as like his PhD thesis on horror.
Yeah.
You know, by which I think he meant that he was basically this contained everything that he worked out to that point about horror and about telling horror stories and horror novels. And I think it does reflect, because that's the fun thing about it is as well as being a horror novel, it is a novel about horror. And horror is, even as a genre, as well as an expression of emotion. There's all the stuff about the kids and the 50s movies that they go and see and all that kind of, like, it's got that thread running through it. It's horror written by someone who also has a love of horror.
Yeah, so it's like he examines it as horror in terms of its cultural reflection, doesn't he? It's like a horror. The horror of history is what he's really looking at when you get down to like the bones of it. He's going down to like the foundations of what horror is, why we need it, why it's used in fiction, you know?
Yes, and I think more and more, as I get older, I realise, whether he knew it or not, it is also a horror story about the horror of America. It's the horror of small town America, and about, you know, the horror. I mean, in terms that I would put it, the horror of you know, capitalist society and what it does to people, at least in part. But as much as that, I feel like, and as much as I think, as you know, again, Weave World may still be my favourite of Barker's, I still think. But I think Imagica is his equivalent. I think Imagica's Barker's PhD thesis on the fantasy novel.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, like yourself, Weave World will always be the one, because it's the sentiment. It's the first one, you know. It's the first one where I really came across this guy's written work.
Yeah.
And that I can just, I mean, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I can still remember what that was like. Yeah. Like the visceral sensation of that, where it's like being filled with light. It's where all the doors blow open. It's where all the preconceptions come off. For a kid that was steeped in Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, like the more traditional fantasy, to read that, it was cataclysmic in the best possible way, and traumatic in the best possible way.
Well, again, revolutionary, right? I mean, and again, and it was the same experience for me, because I'd read a bit of horror, but it was like, oh, you can do this. You can go this far. You can explore these kinds of themes. You can go that deep into psychology and emotion, as well as viscerality and all that kind of stuff. Fucking hell, I
think that's it, isn't it? It's so often that, isn't it? It's like it's that realization that you can. Yeah. That there is no parameter that, like, it's a bit like what D&D players experience when they come to the game for the first time, and they're like looking for the rules. They're looking for the parameters because they think it's like a board game, right? And they say, "Oh, can I do this?" Yeah.
Yeah. Give it a go.
Do whatever you like.
I mean, you got to roll a dice, and you may succeed or not, but you can certainly try. Go for it.
Exactly.
Let's see what happens. Let's find out.
There are no prescriptions here. You do what you like, and I think that's part of the evolution, isn't it, of imagination? And it's so strange how it's like congruent with the evolution of self. How they they often occur during that period. When you are in that interim between childhood and adulthood, when you're really starting to experience your version of the world for the first time.
No, absolutely, yeah, but I think what's fascinating to me with the Magica, and it's so wonderful to hear that it's that it's a hand grenade that's gone off again for someone in his 40s even who's come to it, but because it's just. I think what's amazing, because those texts that you experience at that age, again, we've discussed this many times on various topics, but like sometimes when you come back to them as an adult, they hold up, and sometimes they don't. And it doesn't matter if they don't, right? They still meant to you what they meant to you at the time, and they were important to you, and that's fine. And it's okay to acknowledge both those truths, right? Like, I loved this as a kid, and as an adult, it's not very good. That's fine. But obviously, I think there's a special kind of joy when you come back and discover it's at least as good, if not, frankly, better. Then you had the capacity to realize.
That's wonderful, isn't it? That's such a great thing. I remember having it when I came, like one of the first films I ever saw in my life, like one of the first live action films I ever saw was Labyrinth, was David Bowie's Labyrinth, Jim Henson's Labyrinth. Yes. And I remember loving it to bits. I remember like being immersed in that when I was very, very young, like the imagery, the songs, everything just like pouring into my brain. And then having a break from it for a number of years, long time, and coming back to it as a late teenager, and being astounded by it, like utterly astounded by everything in it, finding it aesthetically and technically beautiful for one thing, but also so smart. I mean, such a clever, transgressive fantasy that deals with all sorts of really complex psychological notions, including, bizarrely for a children's film, the sexual awakening of a teenage girl. It's like, what?
And the fact that it manages to handle it in such a way that's genuinely mature whilst at the same time being completely suitable for a child audience. I mean, that's
so clever.
Is impressive.
It's so clever. What I like, I mean, that element of it, what really gets me about it is that it utilizes imagery and concepts that young women will understand. They will get what it's talking about because they'll understand the experience that Sarah's having. Yeah. And it does it like as though it's written by a woman, even though it isn't. Right. And that is awesome.
Yeah, it's impressive.
So clever. And also, like, on a personal level, putative gay men as well,
well, I was going to say, like, I do wonder how many, like, it will have been. I think it's a movie that will have been an awakening for a lot of people.
Oh, fuck it, yes. That sequence, the Belle Bête ballroom sequence, the dream. Yeah, he is like sexuality made manifest for like young women and young gay guys. He's so beautiful. Yeah. And powerful and enigmatic, and the way he sort of sweeps through the crowd, he's like the central focal point that everything is moving around. Yeah, it makes him mythic, and I just love. I mean, actually, all of Jareth's incarnations, the Goblin King's incarnations in that film, and there are quite a few, are really, really, really beautiful. He's really attractive, but that's the one.
I mean, the thing that's clever as well, though, and the reason I think it works and gets away with the incredible trick that we talked about in terms of being able to portray like a conversation about sexual awakening in a movie that is for kids, which is, I mean, again, let's just take a second. that's a trick.
That's brilliant, right?
But I think a big part of why it works is the way that it's. I mean, I don't know. It's not textual, but it's so heavily implied that it feels that it's somewhere above, slightly above subtext, that that he represents her imagination.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Her, her ideals, her yearnings, and also her fears all at once about male sexuality and what that might look like and how that might connect to her. And I think that's what makes it so clear. And of course, that opens up the genius of the performance for you as an audience to appreciate just how exceptional an actor Bowie was, that he was able to inhabit that.
He's so good because he operates on so many frames and levels in this film. He's threatening and seductive.
Yeah.
He's friendly and he is antagonistic. And you never quite know what his ultimate agendas are. By the end of the film, you could well believe that everything is a confection he's created to help her.
Yeah.
To bring her into herself, to allow her to grow, because that's what happens ultimately. I mean, he even says to her at the end, he has this wonderful line where he says, "You cowered before me, and I was frightening." You know, he gave her what she wanted, and he says, "I'm exhausted from living up to your expectations."
That's such a great line.
Isn't it great? Yeah. Isn't it wonderful? He's like, his imagination let off the hook, right? He's all the dark elements of it, the self-destructive and obsessive elements, the part that wants to give you everything you want rather than everything that you need.
Yeah.
But he's also the other side too. He can give you what you need, and he does. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's so clever, this stuff.
Yeah, no, it is good stuff. It is good stuff. And it is, as I say, it's always a pleasure when you come back. The other one I'm thinking about, again, it's reared up my head just as I think I might. I was on another show recently, the Fantasy Book Swap podcast, which is a wonderful podcast with Ali Baker, who's she's just about to get her PhD actually in children's literature studies. I met her at my first Fantasy Con in like 2016, I think, and we were on Doctor Who panel, and she's just like you meet someone and you just instantly connect.
Yeah.
It's and a mere like 8 years later, I finally made it onto a podcast. She came on Rightopolis as well, like, to be fair. So we've been in touch, but and we talked about tripods on that one, which was great. And she so the way that the format of that show is the guest bring a childhood fantasy book that's a favorite.
Oh, wow.
She matches it with a contemporary book because she knows the field so well.
Yeah.
She twins it with a contemporary book she's read. So you buy the contemporary book, read it. She reads your favorite, and then you go on the show and you talk about both books. Oh,
what a wonderful concept! That's great.
It's a brilliant. And what's great about it is, I mean, it's the perfect show for her because again, this is like she literally her subject specialism. It's not even like I'm not in the way not in the way that this, even with you and I, this is like professional subject level sort of obsession. But also, it's great because it's that social role of actually there's something quite, I think that, and I'd forgotten about it, but there's something quite intimate about swapping books. There's something quite and very, very social about it. There's something very cool about saying like, oh, you like this, you might like that, you might like this as well. And it's lovely to have two texts to compare and contrast. And it's lovely to have two texts where both the host and the guest know both one of the texts really well and the other one they're new to. So you get that. Yeah. It's a really, really good format.
That's lovely, actually. And you also get that wonderful sort of like historical thing going on, like where the books are particular to eras and contexts.
Yeah, of course.
That's great. That's really cool.
And one of the good things that she does, obviously, in the process is she's making recommendations of children's and YA fantasy that's contemporary to people like me who basically, I mean, I can't remember the last time I read YA fantasy. It probably was the Tripods, and that's probably what I read.
I think I haven't. The last young adult, like, it's not a fantasy book really, it's a dystopia, would have been the Hunger Games or something like that.
There you go. Right, exactly. So so to have an expert in the field recommend a book based on your childhood favorite, so all of that's lovely. But one of the topics that came up as a result, and I we'll see what happens, but I did make an offer after the show. I sent her a message because we touched on it during the concert. I said, if you do want to talk about Ender's Game,
wow, that would be
because that's one that, and I don't know why I keep churning on it, because I've done a podcast on it with Daniel Harper. We talked about because we both had a childhood connection to the book. I did a My Life in Horror about it.
Of course,
one of the better ones, if I'm honest. I'm quite proud of the Ender's Game essay. I think because it's all the stuff we talked about revisiting and finding quality. But the interesting thing with Ender's Game was I revisited it, realized it had layers that I hadn't realized before, but also that it was possibly actually evil. And that's a really
it's the C.S. Lewis effect, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
It's that whole thing, it's that whole thing. Which I mean, of course, a lot of people are going to be having that with things like Harry Potter now, of course.
Well, and they have. Well, very publicly, that's been happening, right? As people realise, like these goblins, a little bit on the anti-Semitic side. Let's joke about freeing slaves. Yeah, that's a hilarious thing to joke about.
It's lots of fun. Yeah.
Like there's all kinds of absolutely.
There's lots of meanness in those books. I mean, Ursula K. Le, you've read the Ursula K. Le Guin quote.
I've seen. I can't recall it, but I know.
She basically. I mean, she's not excoriating about it. She's almost kind of dismissive. I mean, this is the woman who wrote the Earthsea.
Right.
It's like, come on, there's no comparison between her and Rowley. I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin is like a goddess. She's just so much better. But she basically said, well, she found them rather ethically mean-spirited. She's
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I mean, it ties in with the fat phobia and the kind of there's all kinds of stuff in there where you're just like, it's just very, and it's that thing of again, and I feel the same way about Ender's Game as well. It's like the way I feel about Ender's Game genuinely is completely independent of my opinions about the author. I obviously I didn't know anything about Card when I initially encountered the book, and obviously I do think his personal political views are abhorrent and repellent to me, and because they are, but it wasn't that. That had nothing to do with the way I felt about the book or the way I feel about it now. That really was a question of coming back to the text without our eyes and just being like, holy shit. And I mean, with Potter, it's interesting because I was just never that invested in it at the time. I mean, I was slightly too old for it. I was in my 20s when it first started to really break. But I did read them. But for me, as they as they came out, but I always felt like it was just like, I remember talking to people about it and just being like, just thinking like, is this it? I mean,
that's exactly my reaction too.
Fine, but it's just not. I mean, it's okay, but
up at that point, I was so immersed in fantasy, of all kinds. I'd read so much by that point. And when, there were people, even, I was like in my mid to late teens when the Potters started to hit. And there were people going nuts about them in like my classes and whatnot. And they're like, okay, I'll give them a go. I'll give them a look, And I remember just not liking them. I found them kind of boring. And I was like, I remember talking to a girl who was absolutely immersed in them in one of my history classes. And I just could not get traction on them. I was sort of like, it's been done before. There are 101 British fantasy books for children where this has been done and done better and more interestingly than this.
Out of interest, I wonder about this as well. Had you by that point, if you can remember, had you read Gaiman's graphic novel, The Books of Magic or Book of Magic, whatever that was called? Was it Books of Magic?
I don't think I had read that.
Because that one, I think part of my issue with Potter was I feel like that one kind of inoculated me against because it does a lot of what Harry Potter does, and it does it a lot better, and it does it a lot quicker. It's a graphic novel that's I can't remember, the original comic may have been 6 issues, and then it was released as a trade. I know they did sequels and whatever, but the original, I think it was called Books of Magic, and it got at all of the core themes of the Potter books, certainly Harry's journey.
Yeah.
But it was a much more, I mean, it's Gaiman. It was just a much more thoughtful and like emotionally deep and resonant meditation on, magic and power and what it would mean to have it and to wield it and to choose it as a child and all this kind of stuff. It's really, there's a wonderful moment in it where, and it's almost, I might have the model wrong. It felt to me like there were elements of the story. It's been too long since I read it, so I'm like, people who have read it will be tearing their hair out now. But to me, it had echoes of Christmas Carol in the sense that the young apprentice has a few different people visit him and show him various aspects of the magical world, because he's got to make the choice, right? Am I going to enter this world or not? Am I going to become a wizard or a magician or whatever it is? And there's at one point he comes face to face with Merlin, and he asks Merlin, should I do this? And Merlin says no. It's a gold. Merlin's description of being a magician is it's a gold-plated crock of shit. And I've clearly never forgotten that moment. Here I am, 30 years after reading it, having not read it in the intervening years. And it's still incredibly vivid moment in my mind. That's
brilliant. The arch wizard, right? The icon of all wizardry outside of Gandalf, right?
Yeah.
Saying that it's all a crock of shit.
It's a gold-plated crock of shit, but the gold-plated is really important too, because it's like it's gaudy, it looks good. You can see why it's aspirational, but you want no part of it. And I thought that was really like. Yeah, that just hit me really hard. And there's some,
that's it. That's the big problem I have with Potter. It has magic in its mythology, but it never stands as a meditation on what that means. There's no metaphor, for example, in the magic of Harry Potter. It's very literal and very material. It's a toy.
Yeah. You say there's no there's no metaphor. There's no real metaphysics.
No, that's it.
Which in a series of stories about magic is a fairly serious flaw, I would have said.
In fact, I would say it reduces magic to a very material level. It turns it into like baubles for toys and convenience. That's all it is.
Yeah, or again, it's a kind of Arthur C. Clarke style, any technology sufficiently advanced, right? I mean, it just feels, because it feels mechanical, right? It feels like in the Harry Potter universe, you have physics and then you have magic, which has its own physics, basically. Like it's just, that's what it is. There's no mystery to it. Now that, again, actually, when I say that out loud, I realized like there's no reason that couldn't work as an approach.
Oh God, no! It could be really interesting. It could be as a meditation. It could be really, but it doesn't go anywhere.
You have to be aware that's what you're doing.
Exactly. It's not interested in any of that, is it? There's nothing there. I mean, the only character who's trying to do anything in that book that's revolutionary is the fucking Nazi bad guy, right? Voldemort is the only active agent. Everyone else is pursuing Rowling's own politics, which is of liberalism and therefore of maintaining that status quo, no matter how awful it is.
Yeah, but also, and that's the thing, isn't it? How awful it is damn right, because Hogwarts is fucking horrific.
Oh, it's horrific. I mean, you know, kids die all the time. And
in defense of Ender's Game, which I think may actually be a fascistic text, right? At least in Ender's Game, also Scott Card understood the battle school was a fucking horrific place to be. Yes. Our horror show. It was a gross, really incredibly unpleasant environment for a child to be in and for children to be in. And but Rowling seems to be in love with Hogwarts and seems to think that we as the readers should all be in love with it as well. It's fucking weird.
Even though it's a horrific
boarding
place.
School. I mean, it's a private boarding school. Yeah. Fuck off. That's where all the people who have destroyed the planet go. That's where they went to school.
Exactly.
Why would I A, want to be there, or B, want to read about other people being there? What the fuck, man?
Yeah, I totally get it. I mean, that was one of the things that pissed me off as a kid as well, because I was just starting to grow into my politics at that point.
Right.
And I understood on a certain level that this is a story that involves class politics but doesn't talk about it.
Look, if in book 7, Harry and Hermione and Ron had fucking burned down Hogwarts, okay, I'd have been on board with that. That would have been a cool story arc. But
absolutely.
But that's the thing. It's that thing where the author is obviously in love with that environment, and that actually that's where I get baffled by the fandom, to be honest. And again, this is not criticism. If you like Harry Potter, you like Harry Potter, good for you. It's 2023. You can find pleasure wherever you can in the world. Go with God. You're not hurting anyone. It's fine.
Yeah.
But for me, with those interactions with the fans, I always find the whole conversation about which house would you be sorted into? I don't want to be sorted into a fucking.
I don't want to be sorted into any of that. That's
it,
right? I remember having this argument when I was 17 with this girl. How fucking horrific is that? These kids at their most formative age are told who they're going to be by this fucking hat. Yeah. This fucking magic hat that tells you, oh, you're in Slytherin, so you're a wanker.
Yeah, exactly.
You're a twat. You're evil.
Right, and don't even get me into the class distinctions. They're like, oh, you're Hufflepuff, oh, you're brave and noble, but you're quite boring, and you'll never have a lead character. And you're basically your job is to, make the bold and brave leaders look good. Oh yeah, this is very left wing, very
horrific. This is absolutely fucking horrific. There is no ethics here, right?
Well, that's it. But that's the thing, isn't it? It's entirely void of ethics, and it thinks it's an ethical text.
Yes, that's it.
that's the essence to me of liberalism, of course.
Yeah.
But like, there's just this assumed morality that they assume everybody has, and it's like an unspoken value. It's like oxygen. It just exists. It's just this morality just is there, and it appears fully formed. In some ways, it's quite religious. It's in that sense quite a conservative idea. The idea that we know right from wrong inherently. We have this core sense of belief and it's like, and then of course you start picking at the rules at all of how that school is organized and the magical world generally. Like, no, this is a fucking horror show.
This is horrific and also just garbage. Like, there's part of me that's with Voldemort. It's like, who says? Fuck off. Who says that you can't study this or do that or do this? There is, I mean, as awful as Voldemort and his Death Eaters are, they do nothing that's equivalent to the horrors that the kids face when they go to school.
You know what? I realised the reason Voldemort's got to be a Nazi is because that excuses all the evils or problems with liberalism. Because at least you're fighting the Nazis, right? And
it's funnily enough, it's the parody, it's the satire that Warhammer 40,000 makes consciously. So in Warhammer 40,000, you've got like the good guys, the Space Marines, who are Ubermensch Nazis, fascists. So the only way, and this is deliberate, this is absolutely part of the satire of the universe, the only way to like make a bad guy worse than they are is to make them like dedicated to actual metaphysical evil. And that's part of the satire, right? That is deliberate. And the Warhammer 40,000 is aware of the fact, it's totally aware of the fact that it's doing that, and that's the difference, isn't it? It's that level of awareness.
Whereas in the case of Potter, again, as Rowling does throughout the series, she's just aping, unconsciously copying another mythology that she's encountered and hasn't even examined in any depth and thinks of as an obvious self-evident truth. In this case, like the myth of World War II, basically, right? The idea that we were uncomplicated the good guys because we were fighting the Nazis. Now, yes, we were fighting the Nazis, and yes, that was a good thing to do. Don't get me wrong, just to be clear. World War II is one of the few wars in human history where I would not have been a pacifist or conscientious objector. Right. I'd have been quite happy to get involved in that one because fascism had to be defeated.
Fighting Nazis is a good thing, right?
Fighting Nazis is a good thing, and God, do I miss, that was an interesting thing talking about the tripods in the 60s, like John Christopher, I think, probably was small c conservative. There are elements of the book that are clearly kind of small c conservative, small r reactionary even, maybe, but it's very clearly an anti-fascist text. And I do rather miss when conservatives used to be explicitly anti-fascist. It's a bit of a shame. We could do with a bit of that right now. It's a shame instead now that they tend to cozy up to them and put them in their cabinets. But there we are. That's 2023 for you. But I think, I think, again, there's that assumption of like you have conservatism and you have liberalism, but then beyond the pale is fascism, and therefore that's always bad, and therefore we'll always fight that. And therefore we're good guys. And it's like,
and in the weirdest way, the existence of the fascist excuses our evils.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And
it's like, no,
but it's always, we're not as bad as them, and therefore ... And it's like, that's not a fucking like you wouldn't get away with that in the playground. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly
like, that's
exactly that.
That's like he started it levels of morality. That's
absolutely
nothing.
Well, I know I pushed him over, but that guy there broke that guy's nose, so
I mean, it's just fucking. But it's not even that, is it? Because they're not even related crimes. It's like you get caught stealing a sweetie out of someone's pocket. And you're like, well, he beat somebody up. Well, so fucking what? Like, well,
right? Exactly. Make you
good just because he beat someone up and you told on him. Okay, good. Exactly. Well done. You still shouldn't be stealing sweets out of people's fucking pockets. Jesus Christ, seriously, man.
But it does go on. It's an interesting one because, like, I've always found Potter to be quite deleterious to fantasy itself.
Oh, interesting.
Because of the nature of what it does with fantasy, which is it demythologizes it. As you said earlier, I mean, you hit it on the head when you said that it pairs the metaphysics out. That's what it does. There's no metaphysics at all. Metaphysics out, and it makes it banal.
Yeah,
it makes it completely banal.
I mean, I don't even think it strains it out. I just think it's just not there. It's an absence. It's a void.
Right. It's in absentia. Yeah. And in that regard, give me the Chronicles of Narnia. Absolutely. Give me the Chronicles of Narnia any day. They are, I mean, I would say they're explicitly fascist at times in their metaphysics. Absolutely they are. But they're trying to do something. They have metaphysics.
Yeah, yeah. And
it exists.
And you get the impression that Lewis really cares about that as well. I mean, the author... I mean, I love it's a really fascinating thing for me reading Lewis. I haven't done it in a number of years actually, but rereading Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in particular, the passages around Aslan and the descriptions of how the children feel when they see Aslan, and it's brilliant because it describes in simple but really powerful terms the religious experience.
And it's sincere, isn't it?
Yes,
it's sincere.
it is.
That's the thing. There is, I mean, as objectionable as I find Lewis's metaphysics at times, that sincerity goes a long way.
Absolutely. I mean, another one, interestingly, that I'm reading at the moment, I've nearly finished it because we're going to be covering it, I hope, in the next season of Writeopolis when that restarts, is Watership Down, which wow. Now, I'm not sure I've read it before. I've obviously seen the movie as a child and was traumatized by it. It was on the
scarred. You still carry those scars.
It would have been like SA 63 or 64 in my life at horror if I kept going. It was on the list. It never quite made it to the top.
It'll
of the
be
list.
on mine. It's
good.
In mine.
Oh, well, I look forward to
it's in mine. Definitely in mine.
But the book, which I'm sort of 4/5 of the way through, so they've just, I mean, spoilers for Watership Down. They've just escaped with a bunch of the does, and I think they've just realised, or no, they haven't realised. We, the reader, have just realised that they have been followed back to the Warren, which is obviously means that something apocalyptic's about to happen. But the interesting thing about Watership Down is that the portrayals of religion in that, the rabbits are all religious.
Oh yeah,
and their religion is, I mean, I love their religion. I love them.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Frith and Ella Frera. My God, the names.
Yeah. And the fact that it's all
rabbit, Ella Frera.
That's wonderful. And it's all done through storytelling. It's an oral tradition, and it's this thing about rabbits, they tell each other the stories over and over again, all that kind of stuff. I love all that. But it's also, for me, what's fascinating is trying to map it on, because you know how, like, with Tolkien, it's like the hobbits are the hobbits are the English, right? Yeah. They're this really they're rural England in this really weird
sort of like rural working class English.
The most rose tinted glasses in human history, like
they're like the idealization of what English people believe themselves to be.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And hang the reality. This is what we imagine. What we
again, I mean, like, I'm kind of I like what Tolkien's trying to do there. I mean, in a way, because he's like, there is an idealization there. There is almost like a utopianism there, because the Shire is a perfect society.
There's also, I think, underneath the surface, there's a yearning there too, which I can't find it in my heart to criticize too much. And again, that's what I feel about Watership Down. I feel, to me, there very much is, because it's also clearly in love with the countryside and the English countryside. In particular, it reminds me of Wind in the Willows in that sense. It's got these, I mean, and it should, for me, especially as a reader, because I grew up in the countryside, I fucking hated it. These long descriptions, or not long actually, they're short, but these regular paragraphs of description about different kinds of flowers, different kinds of leaves, different kinds, like, that should be tedious, but he turns it into poetry.
It's poetry, isn't it?
It's through his sheer love of the subject. And it's the same thing with, like, it's the same with the first third of Moonraker, where it's James Bond playing a game of bridge. I don't know anything about bridge, but I'm in love with the game because Fleming was, and the story makes me fall in love with it as well in the same way. This is the same with the English countryside, and Adams and Wind in the Willows as well does that. But I think what fascinates me is the way that the religion depiction, it really did get me thinking about how it won't have been that long ago that the vast majority of English people would have identified as Christian and would have sincerely believed in various aspects of that. And in that sense, there is a revolution that's happened in our culture in the last 100 years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, wasn't it in the last census there are now more people who are actively identify as atheist now?
Yeah. And that's been a long time coming. A lot of people, and we know from attendances at churches and that there are a lot more people that identify as Christian than go to church. And by the way, that's fine. I'm not judging those people in any way. That's
perfectly fine.
I think however you choose to practice your religion, as long as you're not hurting anyone else, is absolutely fine. So that's okay. Go with God.
There's also the complication, isn't there? Because a lot of people in this, the funny positioning of religion in this country because of our history. So a lot of people who identify as, say, Anglican or C of E are not. They don't believe, they actively don't believe in anything, but it's what's on their birth certificate.
Yeah, and it's the birth, marriages, deaths people, right? I mean, that's what they go to church, and sure, and absolutely. And there is that. I think there are, maybe millions of people in this country that identify that way. And even so, we've now hit that census tipping point, which again is just, is a fascinating thing. But one of the things that really Watership Down really made me think about and engage with is the idea of what it's like in a society where everyone basically does believe the same thing. It's the homogenous nature of that, and it's really interesting because it's one of those things that instinctively, intellectually, I would rebel against.
Likewise.
Find myself inherently attracted to plurality of thought. I find myself inherently attracted to diversity. Like I just do. I feel more comfortable. I feel more comfortable experiencing discomfort because I'm out of my comfort zone, if you see what I mean. Like genuinely, I prefer to be learning new things, butting up against new ideas, discovering new points of view, all that kind of stuff. Like I think that to me is a sign of a strong society, one that has a genuine kind of. But it's interesting, again, something written from the inside with genuine love. Talking about, and you see, okay, I understand the contours of the argument here. I understand this is an insider's view of a specific, and again, it's clearly idealized, right? Because he's got rabbits, so he can do what he wants.
Exactly right. This is not like an actual church. This is not an actual religion. This is it's a culture of talking rabbits, right?
and it's not necessarily interesting. It's not necessarily that the rabbit god is real and that's why they all believe it, because he does have the warren where they don't really believe anymore. But that is a sign of corruption. That is
it's the warren that's lethargic and they have nothing.
Right.
They have nothing going on, do they? It's like a dying warren.
Well, it's a utopia. They have abundant food all the time and they don't have to hunt and they don't have to forage and everything's great. Like, what's your problem? And the problem is that they're being farmed.
It's lethargy, right?
Right, but like the cost, it reminded me actually that of it might have been, I think it was Le Guin. Was it Le Guin? I'm getting confused now. The short story about the child in the basement. There's the perfect society.
That's not Le Guin. It is one of the big science fiction writers.
Yeah.
It's, I'm thinking Asimov, but I don't think that's right.
No, it's a woman. It is a woman. It's
it's
that's gonna bug me. Anyway.
Yes.
Come back to this. But yeah. And it's that for me is that or if you want to put it another way, it's another version of Stephen King's It, right? The quiet prosperity of Derry, and all you've got to do is put up with the fact that a dozen or so of your children are going to get eaten once every 30 years, right?
Yeah, right. He's talking there. I mean, that warren is emblematic of what happens when it's not necessarily the lack of religion as such; it's the lack of a narrative.
Absolutely.
It's what we're suffering from at the moment, right? I mean, we in the UK are suffering from this complete breakdown of all cultural narrative. There is actually like a great gaping abyss where there was any kind of narrative. The problem is there were competing narratives at one point, and one of those narratives was around a genuinely multicultural, tolerant, inclusive country that was going to, through progressive values, develop a blah blah blah, and that was always a minority position, and it was always one that you had to fight for, but it was one that had a certain amount of mainstream support in certain influential cultural areas. But now we're at the point where neither major political party are prepared to begin to make that point. They're all accept as too
given.
Terrified of going near it,
So they accept as given all kinds of prerequisites about, patriotism in the worst possible sense of the word, about British ideals and values that are exclusive rather than inclusive. But
it's all echoes in the abyss, isn't it? None of them actually believe anything.
No,
even the ones who are like acting in a fascist way don't actually believe in like ideological fascism as such. They're just doing it because that's it. It serves them. We're in this sort of like narcissistic void now. There's no vision of tomorrow. There's not even like a Nazist vision of tomorrow. There's nothing.
No, and that's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing about where you get it every year now. You get, like, for example, you get the New Year's fireworks in London, and you'll get like this amazing display, and then you'll get these sound clips interspersed, and there'll always be a moment where like the drones form a picture of planet Earth, and you hear David Attenborough saying, "Of course, man-made climate change has caused several problems, and there are great challenges ahead of us that we must somehow face," and everyone just sort of nods and smiles, and it's like, no, the world's going to fucking end in about 100 years for all of us, unless we have a revolution on a global scale of the kind of which we have never seen before. That's what's actually happening. Do I need to put it in those terms before anybody No, we're just going back to work. Okay, cool.
I mean, you can say that as well. I mean, you can put it in those terms, and people just don't listen. That's the most fascinating thing. There's that switch off, isn't there? There's something that people do to protect themselves. You know.
We know it though.
Yeah, of course we do. It's part of why things are breaking down, right? It's part of why we are allowing for atrocity. It's because we're so lethargic. It's because somewhere in our subconscious something is saying it doesn't matter because we're nearing the end anyway.
I also think it's fear though, and I think fear is being manipulated very expertly by the worst possible people, which of course it always will be. I mean, the reason that the reason that for the last 5 years we've seen a massive campaign of xenophobia and in particular anti-immigration rhetoric is because in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the climate disaster is going to cause, again, on a scale unimaginable in human history, we're going to see a scale of displacement, right? Yes. As certain parts of the world become impossible to live in.
Completely uninhabitable.
Just not fit for human habitation at any point. I mean, there's this thing, this amazing phrase I came across recently reading about the recent heat wave in, Houston? Mm-hmm. No, I can't remember, or New Mexico, wherever it was, Arizona. Anyway, where they had like 30 days of extreme heat. I mean, extreme heat to the point of if you didn't have air conditioning, you would die. That's how hot it was. And it's this thing called wet bulb, where the temperature reaches a certain point, and not only do your body's natural defense systems against heat no longer work, they work against you.
Oh my God.
And the fact that you sweat, it actually becomes a problem, because the moisture on your skin actually further warms your body rather than cools it, because the ambient temperature is so hot. And that was how hot it had gotten in this city for this, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it was.
Jesus.
Now, in this particular case, at the moment, that particular city does have air conditioning. It does have a somewhat reliable power supply that will continue to give it air conditioning. But you don't have to extrapolate very far from that to the rest of the world. Either to countries whose infrastructure is not as well developed as that for various reasons relating to colonialism and economic deprivation and catastrophe, entirely inflicted by the people who are currently sitting in the Western world and their air conditioning, of course. And sorry, not the people, the countries. The people didn't have much to do with it a lot of the time. And and indeed countries like ours, which will be experiencing temperatures like that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and that don't have air conditioning.
Don't have the infrastructure,
anything like it. Well, we have a road system where we produce our roads with a particular kind of tarmac that melts at certain temperatures. And we did that because those temperatures had never been experienced in this country, so we didn't need to buy the more expensive stuff, so we didn't. And it made perfect sense at the time. It's just unfortunately the vehicles that were going over that tarmac have created a situation where we are now going to need it. And and I have no faith in any of the current political parties or their leadership that any significant changes that need to be made will currently be made.
No.
Or indeed will even begin to gesture in the right direction.
I mean, I go even further. I don't believe the systems we have are adequate. Like the entire structures we have are adequate for dealing with the problems that we're going to be facing,
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think weirdly, I do think we still have the people, by which I mean I think we have the raw intellectual capacity potential and emotional capacity potential, because I do see that day to day. I see that a lot actually, and it gives me great encouragement. That's the only thing really giving me hope right now. But I think at the moment we have infrastructures of all kinds that are actively hostile to those intellects and to those emotional. That's the problem we've got, is that every time those values or those qualities bubble up to the surface, the infrastructure finds a way to flatten them.
Absolutely,
or smash them into a million pieces.
There are obvious examples from recent history, right? I mean, very recently we've had the classic right-wing attack on the humanities and the arts in universities and schools and whatnot. And we know why. I mean, unless you're a complete moron, quite frankly, and I'm quite comfortable saying that at this point, unless you're an idiot, you know why they're doing it.
Absolutely. Why on earth do we think they're attacking the subjects that are most likely to give people critical faculties necessary to interrogate the media they consume for biases and for
the ability to identify and deconstruct narrative?
It's
what they never want. It's what they never want. The right cannot survive that, especially if like normal people, just working people have that.
Oh, and what's the other subject in the humanities? Oh, yeah, history.
History, exactly.
Let's maybe not let people pay attention to that, because God forbid anyone look at the state of the world right now, look at the patterns of previous behavior, and start extrapolating on where we're going to end up if we're not careful. Because
absolutely, and
that would be bad.
Also, see that the myths of history with which they've been brought up are complete garbage, right?
Yeah, stand absolutely, melt under the sunlight of any kind of rational examination whatsoever. Yeah,
I think it is like an awakening moment a lot of people have when they start reading the actual history outside of like GCSE textbooks.
Yeah, that's right.
Of World War II.
Oh yeah, I mean that's just to pick one example, but yeah, absolutely right, and it's a good one to pick because it is. I mean, I've talked about this probably too many times. It is the national mythology of this country. It is actually, at this point, it genuinely feels like a cancerous myth to me. It actually feels
completely.
Like,
the dynamic that we are fed is wrong. It's false. Yeah. It's completely false. The notion of this scrappy little island that was fought against the Nazis, it's garbage. It's complete wankery nonsense.
And what's really infuriating about it is it's dangerous and it's tumorous and it's leading people into very bad places and very ugly thoughts and very ugly deeds. It's creating this real. Also, the real history is so much more fucking interesting.
Oh god, yeah, it's fascinating.
So much more powerful,
and so much more based on chance and luck rather than like the decisions of great heroic figures and whatnot. It's we survived by almost complete fluke,
Yeah, it is. I would add to that though what I was talking about earlier, and some incredible ingenuity as well.
I mean, like absolutely.
Not at the leadership level. I hasten to add.
No.
The only quality really I think that I do find somewhat admirable in the leadership of this country in World War II were the ones who, and I have to say, and it turns to ash in my mouth because I hate the man, but I will give Churchill credit for this, and perhaps this alone. He was smart enough to know what he wasn't smart about, and he was also just about egoless enough to hand off to the people who were smart enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then bully them into get done. And that's a quality that is, I mean, to me, that should be a prerequisite before you set foot in any office of state or power whatsoever. Like, if you haven't demonstrated your ability to do that, you should not be able to take charge of anything. Because what the fuck is a leader? You know what I mean? Like, if it's not someone who can get the best out of the people around them and identify the best people to, you know what I mean? Like, that's how far we've fallen, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always look at the great hero of the, I hate the fact that people like attribute, but he won us the war. No, he fucking didn't. No, read the fucking history book. If it was up to him, we'd have actually lost the war and we'd have started World War III.
I'll make a case for who won the war. I'll make a case for the partisans in Yugoslavia. That killed the general that made Hitler so pissed off that he delayed invading Russia by like 3 or 4 weeks so he could go in and flatten the civilian population, and he did, and it was horrific war crime, and tens if not hundreds, I think tens of thousands certainly of civilians were murdered by Nazis in retaliation, but it delayed the attack on Russia by about a month, and guess what, they ground to a halt 20 miles from Moscow,
and couldn't get a step further,
but that's because the snow hit, and the snow hit because they waited a month. That you want to talk about who won the war, and
and also, the snow was significant, but the Russian fucking military.
Well,
Jesus Christ,
absolutely. I mean, the war was won with like American gold and Russian blood. I mean, the millions of Russian soldiers that died on that front.
The stories, and it's hard to determine whether they're apocryphal or whether they are sort of like mythologized or not, of what the Russian soldiery did. During that conflict is unbelievable.
There's a movie. It's a really superb movie, I think. Called. I don't know about the history of it, but it's a good bit of cinema called Enemy at the Gates, and it's Jude Law is a Russian sniper, and it's World War II, and it's the Battle of Stalingrad, and the opening depiction of it is one of those, and to me it's absolutely on a par with of an equal to the opening 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, which again is just whatever you think about the rest of that film, those first 20 minutes,
amazing. That was some of the most
exhilarating, terrifying cinema you'll ever see, right? Just because as a realistic depiction of a genuine conflict that ordinary people did. Stalingrad's like that too, and this, I think the opening scene of Enemy at the Gates is the equal of that, and it's a battle. So this guy arrives, he's a conscript. He arrives on a boat, and you see like the boats crossing the river, and you see boats getting hit by shells, and whole boats full of people getting blown up. They get to the other side, which is where the actual front of the battle is, and the way the assignation works is they run past this, these guys handing out weapons, and every other soldier is given a rifle.
Oh wow.
And one of you gets a rifle, and the guy behind you gets an ammo clip, but no rifle. And you are told you pick up the rifle from the guy in front of you.
Wow.
And that happened. That's not apothetical. That's history. That's
wow.
What the Russian army did at Stalingrad to hold back. And they just ran into the machine guns. And by the way, if you're a Russian soldier in that situation with no rifle in your hand, you'd run into the machine gun anyway, because if you don't, you do get shot in the back of the head.
Get shot in the back, yeah.
By the political officer. So let's not.
The commissariat, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So let's not eulogize this. It was fucking horrific.
Oh, evil, yeah, absolutely evil. And you would have been conscripted. I mean, fucking hell, it's Russia, right? You would have been.
No, you were a conscript. You were of age, so you were male, so you went. That was it.
And probably not. Let's be honest.
Yeah, there were a lot of kids too. Yeah, a lot of kids. But I mean, it's just that. But that you want to know how that again. That's how it was won. But this is the point, isn't it? As you start examining and talking about it, these are the stories, and there are so many of these stories. And yeah, absolutely, there's the story of the code breakers, and again, you want to talk about that. Like, yes, we should talk about the code breakers, and we should talk about the stories there, because they're really important.
We should talk about what we did to the one who actually helped, who basically allowed us to survive, Alan Turing, obviously. What we did to him, right?
Well, this is it. There's two reasons. There's two things I wanted to say. Yeah, that's the first one. Absolutely, look at Turing and look at what a man who was treated with nothing but contempt by his country and society did anyway in the cause of fighting fascism, and look at how he was repaid.
Yeah.
And look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, are we doing better or worse?
Great Britain, rah rah, put your fucking flags down, you wankers,
Exactly. Yeah, great. Okay, so the Queen did pardon him like 50 years later, but
great. After he committed suicide and after he'd been chemically castrated, and brilliant, great, woo.
But the other thing with Turing is, and I say this to take nothing away from the man himself. He was a genius. He was one of a kind. He was incredibly important. He also was part of a team.
Yes,
and it was an incredible team. And we don't know all the names of all those people, but they all contributed in these incredible ways. And that's the other thing about that. That was only possible because of an incredible amount of cooperation between a bunch of very, very, very bright people. None of them had all the answers themselves. It required, and again, these are stories we don't tell anymore because we all want to hear about the rugged individual.
Yeah.
Because that's the only unit that society is prepared to admit exists, or that can generate. Like we live in a place now where cooperation is a dirty word. Competition is the only thing that matters, because competition generates wealth.
Yeah.
And that's really important, because that's the only thing that actually matters, because living on a survival planet doesn't. What matters is wealth generation. So anything that from history that teaches us about the power of cooperation is not something we hear about.
Right?
So even when you do hear about it, even when you hear about someone like Turing, and you hear about this historical figure, and again, to take nothing away from the man, he was important, but you don't hear anything about it's just Turing. There was this guy Turing, and he cracked the code. He won the war. It's like,
right. You don't hear about the team, or the engineers, or the people around him.
Right. It was an endeavor with a bunch of really bright people and a bunch of really skilled specialist people as well. And it was a team. It was like hundreds of people in there at its peak, all, by the way, working under incredible conditions of anonymity and security. There's this hilarious story about a man and a woman who met after the war, got married, and they, because they all signed the Official Secrets Act, and they only discovered that they both worked at Bletchley Park on 30th anniversary, when they both got invites separately to come. It would still be a secret. And they both made up stories to each other to get away, and then met at the event. That's the first time they realized.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
And these are quote unquote ordinary people who after that went about their lives, got married, never spoke a word about what they'd done, what they'd been a part of.
It's like, you see it happening all the time, don't you? That is something that happens so much. We're seeing it recently we had the movie Oppenheimer, obviously. Now, everyone remembers Robert Oppenheimer because he famously was on that television show where he said the famous line, "I am become Shiva, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But the Manhattan Project was huge.
Yeah.
There were literally hundreds of mathematicians and scientists and physicists and chemists involved in that project.
And to be fair, I think that's one of the things that the movie does passably well, is it does represent it very much as a team effort, and it does at least gesture at the idea of Oppenheimer's flair for, I guess we'd call it celebrity these days. I don't know if that was a term that was in wide use at that point, but it's kind of what he was doing in a way. And it doesn't, it neither praises nor condemns him for that, which I think is also fair. But it does, I think, go some way to depict, no, that was a team effort. That was an incredible team effort. And I think, and that's right. I mean, I'm obviously less happy with the the
results
on that particular one, and it's fascinating that as well, how the movie, it takes great pains to make clear that Oppenheimer's overwhelming ambition, certainly when the project began, was to get to the bomb before the Nazis did. And sure, that I can, I mean, I'm not a nuclear physicist, so I'm never gonna have to worry about this, but I think I can imagine in that situation feeling a similar motivation, right? I can, to me, I'm certainly not going to condemn anyone that decided that was the thing that they had to do. Because, looking at the state of the world at that point, I mean, Hitler with a nuke,
that probably would have been the end, wouldn't it?
I think that's probably not a good thing.
Probably, in an alternate timeline, the Earth is probably desolate, right?
Yeah, I think there's probably a version of the world where we didn't make it through, if that's what happened. I mean, God, you want to talk about ironies of history? Hitler's anti-Semitism is what made bunches, a lot of Jewish scientists who ended up building the bomb in America. I mean, that's, to me, that's how you make a case for God. That's how you make a case for religion.
Yeah,
the idea that this guy's own I mean, there's something so poetic about that. His own.
There is. It's almost mythic, isn't it? It
kind of is. Yeah, it kind of.
And it's a microcosm for all fascism, isn't it? Because that's what happens to fascist societies anyway. Because they have nothing underneath, right? They eat themselves. They devour themselves.
They absolutely do. And it's something that King talks about in Desperation. I remember when we covered that a long time ago now. But it's one of the things I think King's right about that. There's the kid has his dialogue with God. David, the child, has a dialogue with God, and he says at one point, like, God's willing them to go and fight the big evil nasty, and he says to God, "Well, if I don't fight it, will it take over the world?" And God's like, "No, evil's stupid and self-defeating, and it will always destroy itself. I want you to fight it because it's my will that you fight it."
Yeah, right. All right, fair enough.
But which is, a whole other thing. But
there's a whole other thing, right?
You go back and find that one, guys. That's on there.
Yeah. We do get deeper into that discussion on that one, by the way.
We go all over that. But I think when you think about that in terms of Oppenheimer and that whole thing, I think that there is that situation where fascist societies are cannibalistic. They will inevitably implode. They will, because it's based on this viciousness. It's the virtue
and emptiness as well. That's the other thing. I think that's even more corrosive than the viciousness, to be honest. It's the fact that there is no foundation. There's nothing to carry it forward. They have actually no ideas as such, beyond the purely aesthetic. But beyond the purely aesthetic.
Yeah, and it tests to destruct the idea that that's going to ever be enough for anything.
But it's one of the weird myths of World War II, one of the unspoken myths that we are programmed with, which is that the Nazis had a functioning idea for a society. They fucking didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the trains ran on time, and no, they fucking didn't.
It's complete garbage. It's complete garbage.
Yeah, and it's tied up in some fairly crude, some fairly crude. I mean, racism really about the the notion of German efficiency is sort of kind of well trodden trope at this point. It's just like anything like that. It's a laughably kind of inaccurate kind of. It's so exaggerated. It's just so, I mean, it's so on the surface ridiculous, right? As soon as you start talking about a nation state of millions of people as having a particular quality of character, you just sound like a fucking idiot to me.
Absolutely.
You just, and again, you're buying into. I mean, at the point you do that, you're buying into the same mythology. I mean, that is one of the foundational myths of fascism that it's built on. It's as much as it has any foundation, is the notion that nation states have, the people in them have particular characters and characteristics that are in their blood, that are immutable, that are and it's like, guys,
the misunderstanding of so many arenas, history, geography, anatomy, biology, it's just so many things. The simplification, the reductionism necessary for that, it's basically fantastical.
Yeah, it is. No, it is. That's exactly what it is. It's mythological. And that's fine if actually you're just trying to tell a fun story.
Yes.
I like fun stories. That's what we're normally here to talk about, is fun stories. I have a problem with it when you're using it as a foundation for a society where you're just going to start murdering anybody that doesn't fit into your fucking idea of what a human being should be.
Absolutely.
You know, that's when I'm going to start to have, you know, that's when, to quote a recent placard I saw at a march, that's when I'm going to start identifying as a fucking problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's the people are more important than stories.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Absolutely. And I say that
as a writer, you know, someone who thinks stories are absolutely sacred.
Yeah. But that's the thing, isn't it? And stories are double-edged swords. There are stories that can tell us great stories about ourselves that help us to become better people, and we love those stories. And then there are stories that the other kind of story that
they twist our minds, they infect our minds. They're the Daily Mail stories, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They are brain rot. They are fungus. They're worms in our heads.
And I think, you know, when I think about the kind of work we cover, I think as well there are the stories that are warnings. There are the stories that we tell ourselves that remind us of what we are capable of, for good and for ill, and that remind us of the depths to which we are capable of sinking, and, you know, stand as, hopefully, as warnings, as enjoinders, as messages, as signposts that say, "Here be dragons," you know.
Oh, I like that. The "Here be dragons." Yeah, I mean, that's it essentially, isn't it? It's "Here be dragons." Yeah, that's a very good. I might call the episode that. I like that.